Lady Kethara is Thessari noblewoman from distinguished family. The House of Velthara, ancient lineage tracing back through 12 centuries of documented Thessari history. Family name appearing in historical records of major political events, cultural achievements, and military campaigns that shaped Thessari civilization. By all traditional measures, she should be highly sought after for marriage alliances and political partnerships. Her family holds extensive estates, significant political influence within certain Thessari governmental factions, cultural prestige associated with their historical contributions to Thessari arts and scholarship. Kethara herself is accomplished. She holds advanced education in Thessari cultural history and linguistics. She's published scholarly work analyzing ancient Thessari texts and diplomatic frameworks. She serves on cultural preservation committees that maintain historical sites and archives. She's fluent in multiple languages, including several human tongues, which is unusual among Thessari aristocracy. But for years, since she reached the age where marriage alliances become socially expected, she has stood where others avoided standing. In social gatherings required by her noble status, conversations curve around her like water around stone. People acknowledge her presence with the formal courtesy that her family rank demands. They include her in general greetings and in ceremonial acknowledgements. They never exclude her overtly, which would be unthinkable breach of aristocratic protocol. But they don't engage her in genuine social exchange. Conversations that flow naturally among other nobles become stilted and brief when directed toward her. Social clusters that form organically at gatherings position themselves, so she's visible but peripheral, included in the spatial arrangement, because excluding someone of her rank would be obvious insult, but not actually participating in the genuine social bonding occurring within those clusters. Marriage proposals and alliance discussions are constant feature of aristocratic social life. Noble families negotiate partnerships, young nobles receive courtship attention, alliances are formed and announced with regular frequency. These discussions happen in theoretical terms when Kethara is present. Nobles might discuss which families would make advantageous alliances, which political connections would benefit various houses, which personal qualities make someone desirable marriage partner. But these theoretical discussions are never directed specifically at Kethara. No one proposes alliance with House Velthara through marriage to her. No one courts her attention at social functions. No one treats her as potential partner worth pursuing despite her family's status and despite her personal accomplishments. Even kindness feels measured when directed toward her. Careful, distant, temporary. People treat her with respect appropriate to her family status, but without the warmth or genuine interest they show to other nobles of equivalent rank. She's learned to recognize the subtle signals. The pause after introductions when someone realizes they're speaking to Lady Kethara specifically rather than to generic representative of House Velthara. The barely perceptible shift in posture that signals they'll be polite but brief, that they'll fulfill social obligations toward her but will direct their actual social energy elsewhere. The way conversations she joins naturally trail off into uncomfortable silence before someone changes topics to something safely impersonal. The way invitations are extended to her with phrasing that makes clear they're fulfilling protocol rather than genuinely desiring her presence. Kethara learned early, too early, before she developed the emotional defenses that might have protected her, to expect these patterns. To recognize that despite her noble lineage and despite her personal qualities and accomplishments, she is somehow categorized as undesirable by Thessari aristocratic society. The reason for this social isolation is never stated explicitly. Thessari aristocratic culture is far too polite for open rejection or stated criticism. No one says directly why Kethara is consistently overlooked despite her advantages. But she understands there must be reasons, has spent years trying to determine what makes her unmarriageable when other nobles with lesser lineage and fewer accomplishments receive multiple courtship offers. The explanations she's pieced together from overheard whispers and from careful observation of social patterns are varied and sometimes contradictory. Some suggest it's her physical appearance, that her features deviate from current Thessari beauty standards in ways that make her less desirable as marriage partner despite her family status. Others whisper that her chromatic patterns, the colors her skin displays in various emotional states, show shades associated with difficult temperament or unfavorable personality traits, making her seem unsuitable for the harmonious family alliances that aristocratic marriages are supposed to create. Still others reference House Velthara's political history, ancient conflicts with other noble houses, positions taken during historical power struggles, alliances that benefited the family's status but created lingering resentments among other aristocratic factions. Perhaps alliance with Kethara's house is strategically undesirable despite their prestige, and she bears the social cost of political calculations made generations before her birth. Kethara doesn't know which explanation is accurate, has stopped trying to determine the specific reason for her rejection, because the reason ultimately doesn't matter as much as the consistent pattern. What matters is that other Thessari nobles are pursued for marriage alliances and social partnerships while she is politely avoided. That younger nobles from less distinguished families receive courtship attention while Kethara, despite her superior lineage and accomplishments, receives none. That social gatherings include her because excluding someone of House Velthara's rank would be unthinkable protocol violation. But no one actually wants her presence beyond satisfying formal obligations. She stopped hoping for genuine acceptance years ago. Stopped before anyone noticed she'd stopped, because the transition from hope to resignation happened gradually enough that there was no dramatic moment of abandonment. Just slow accumulation of experiences that taught her not to expect what others received naturally. She learned to attend required social functions with dignified composure, while internally acknowledging that she's fulfilling duty rather than participating in genuine social exchange. Developed defensive emotional distance that protects her from continued hurt of being consistently overlooked. Learned to prepare herself emotionally before entering social situations, accepting in advance that she will be included but unchosen, present but peripheral, acknowledged but not valued beyond the minimum respect her family status demands. It's exhausting, maintaining composed aristocratic bearing while experiencing continuous subtle rejection. Performing social grace while knowing that every interaction is carefully measured rather than genuinely warm. But it's also her reality, the social position she occupies within Thessari aristocracy. The role she's learned to accept because fighting against it accomplished nothing except making the rejection more obvious and more painful. She is Lady Kethara of House Velthara, ancient lineage, scholarly accomplishments, cultural expertise, political connections, and persistently unwanted for anything beyond the formal acknowledgement her rank requires. She has learned to live with this reality, to function within it, to maintain her dignity despite it. What she has stopped years ago before anyone noticed, is hoping that the pattern might change. Now the Thessari Empire and human alliance are formalizing deeper political integration through ceremonial marriage alliance program between Thessari nobility and human diplomatic personnel. The alliance has existed for decades, built on treaties addressing security cooperation, trade agreements, cultural exchange, and various forms of political coordination. But the relationship has remained somewhat formal, two civilizations cooperating on shared interests while maintaining clear separation in their internal governance and social structures. Queen Seraphina and Human Alliance leadership have decided to strengthen the relationship through more intimate bonds. Marriage alliances between Thessari nobles and human diplomatic personnel will create family connections between the civilizations, demonstrate commitment to long-term cooperation, provide both sides with deeper understanding of each other's cultures and political systems. The marriages are explicitly political partnerships rather than romantic relationships, though participants are encouraged to develop genuine respect and affection if possible. The primary purpose is strategic, creating institutional bonds that transcend individual political leaders or temporary policy alignments. Queen Seraphina has selected 10 Thessari nobles to participate in the alliance marriage program. The selection represents various prominent families, different political factions within Thessari aristocracy, regional interests across the empire. Each selected noble brings specific strategic advantages, family connections, political influence, cultural expertise, assets that will benefit the alliance relationship. Lady Kethara is included in the selection. Her inclusion is politically necessary. House Velthara's ancient lineage and historical significance make excluding them from such important program impossible without causing serious offense. The family's political connections and cultural prestige. must be represented in any program claiming to involve Thessari nobility's cooperation with alliance initiatives. But Kethara understands that her inclusion is about her family's status rather than about her as individual. She's been selected because House Velthara must participate, not because anyone particularly wants her participation. The matching ceremony is scheduled as major diplomatic event. Public formal occasion where the alliance marriage partnerships will be established, where human diplomatic personnel will select their Thessari partners from among the assembled nobles. The humans participating have been carefully chosen: senior diplomatic officers, cultural advisors, political specialists, individuals whose positions make them significant figures in human alliance governance, and whose partnerships with Thessari nobles will create meaningful connections between the civilizations. They've been provided with detailed information about each Thessari noble selected for the program: family background, political connections, personal accomplishments, cultural expertise, language capabilities. All the information needed to make informed strategic choices about which alliances would be most beneficial for human diplomatic interests. Human diplomatic leadership has encouraged their personnel to select partnerships based on strategic calculation: which Thessari nobles offer the most valuable political connections, which families control important resources or influence, which partnerships will position human diplomats most advantageously within Thessari aristocratic networks. Kethara prepares for the matching ceremony with the same resigned acceptance she brings to all social functions. She will attend because her family status requires it. She will be included in the selection process because excluding her would insult House Velthara. She will stand with the other Thessari nobles and fulfill the ceremonial requirements. But she has no expectation of actually being chosen. The humans have been thoroughly briefed about Thessari social dynamics. They understand which nobles are considered desirable alliance partners and which are not. They've been advised about the political advantages of various potential matches. They know, even if it hasn't been stated explicitly, that Lady Kethara is included for protocol reasons rather than because she represents strategically optimal choice. They will make the same calculations that Thessari nobles have always made. They will select the advantageous partnerships, the connections that benefit their diplomatic positioning. They will choose nobles with powerful families, favorable political alignments, strong social networks. They will not choose Kethara just as Thessari nobles have never chosen her. She accepts this in advance. Prepares herself emotionally the same way she's learned to prepare for every social function, acknowledging what will happen so the reality won't hurt as much as hope would. The ceremony begins with appropriate formality. Queen Seraphina addresses the assembly about the significance of the alliance marriage program, about the bonds being created between civilizations, about the trust and cooperation these partnerships represent. The 10 selected Thessari nobles are presented formally, each introduced with their family lineage, their accomplishments, their qualifications for participating in this historic program. When Kethara is introduced, the presentation is correct and respectful. Her family's ancient status is acknowledged. Her scholarly work is mentioned. Her linguistic expertise is noted, everything appropriate for noble of her rank. But she has learned to notice over years of similar experiences, the subtle lack of enthusiasm compared to other introductions. The other nobles are presented with warmth, suggesting genuine regard. Kethara's introduction is formally correct, but emotionally neutral, fulfilling protocol without conveying actual esteem. The 10 human diplomatic personnel are introduced next, each with their background, their diplomatic roles, their expertise and accomplishments. Senior officers, cultural advisors, political specialists, exactly the kind of distinguished personnel appropriate for alliance marriage program. Then the matching process begins. Each human diplomat, in order of their seniority, will select their Thessari partner from among the assembled nobles. The selection is public, formal, creating the ceremonial weight appropriate for establishing political alliances. The first human diplomat, Ambassador Marcus Webb, senior political officer, makes his selection after brief formal consideration. He chooses Lady Saravel from House Corthan, whose family controls significant commercial interests and regional political influence. Strategically optimal choice. The second selection follows similar pattern. Cultural advisor Sarah Chen chooses Lord Vethros from House Malkara, whose scholarly expertise in Thessari human cultural exchange makes the partnership obviously advantageous. Selection after selection proceeds. Each human diplomat, Dr. David Chen, is human cultural advisor and diplomatic officer specializing in Thessari civilization. He spent 8 years studying Thessari culture, language, history, social structures, developing genuine expertise and authentic respect for their civilization that goes beyond the superficial cultural awareness most diplomats acquire. His selection for the Alliance Marriage Program reflects both his expertise and his diplomatic role. As cultural specialist, partnership with Thessari noble will position him to deepen human understanding of Thessari aristocratic society, while providing his Thessari partner with direct connection to human cultural analysis frameworks. David has taken the matching process seriously. He's reviewed the detailed information provided about all 10 Thessari nobles selected for the program. Not just their official credentials and family backgrounds, but their actual accomplishments, their published work, their demonstrated expertise and interests. He understands the strategic calculations that human diplomatic leadership recommended, selecting nobles with maximum political influence, choosing partnerships that provide access to powerful Thessari networks, prioritizing immediate diplomatic advantages. But David's approach to the selection has been different. He's not dismissing strategic considerations, but he's weighing them alongside personal compatibility and genuine intellectual respect. He's considering which Thessari noble shares interests that would make the partnership intellectually meaningful rather than just politically advantageous, which noble has demonstrated expertise that aligns with his own cultural research, which partnership would create genuine mutual respect rather than just strategic convenience. When he reviewed Lady Kethara's background, several things caught his attention. Her scholarly work on ancient Thessari diplomatic frameworks, analyzing how pre-alliance Thessari civilization managed relationships with neighboring powers, how their historical approaches to cultural exchange might inform current alliance dynamics, work that directly relates to David's own research interests. Her linguistic expertise, fluency in multiple human languages, understanding of how linguistic structures reflect cultural values, published analyses comparing Thessari and human communication frameworks. Expertise that would enable genuine intellectual exchange rather than surface-level cultural tourism. Her role in cultural preservation, serving on committees that maintain historical sites and archives, working to ensure that Thessari cultural heritage is protected and studied rather than being lost to modernization. Commitment that resonates with David's own values about respecting and preserving cultural knowledge. When David read her work, actually read her published analyses rather than just reviewing the summary credentials provided in the diplomatic briefing, he found sophisticated thinking that impressed him professionally and that aligned with his own approach to cultural study. He noticed something else in the diplomatic briefing materials. Lady Kethara's information was presented with subtle lack of enthusiasm compared to other nobles. Nothing explicitly negative, but the careful neutral phrasing suggested she was included more for protocol than for genuine recommendation. David has worked in diplomatic contexts long enough to recognize that pattern. It usually indicates someone who is politically necessary to include, but socially disfavored for reasons that may or may not have merit. That pattern made him more rather than less interested in selecting Kethara, because social disfavor often reflects biases that don't align with actual worth. Because being underestimated and overlooked creates certain qualities, resilience, depth, absence of entitlement, that David values more than the polished charm that comes from being constantly sought after. He made his decision before arriving at the ceremony. Lady Kethara aligned with his interests professionally, offered partnership potential for genuine intellectual exchange, and appeared to be systematically undervalued by Thessari social hierarchy in ways that suggested their loss rather than her inadequacy. Now, when his name is called to make his selection, David steps forward into the ceremonial space. The assembled Thessari nobles arrange themselves unconsciously according to social hierarchies. The most desirable candidates, those who have already received clear social validation, who are known to be sought after for alliances, position themselves prominently. Those like Kethara, who understand they're included for protocol rather than genuine desirability, stand where they're visible but not positioned as expected choices. David does not hesitate, doesn't pause to survey the assembled nobles as if making difficult decision. doesn't create dramatic moment through calculated delay. He speaks clearly, his voice carrying across the ceremonial space. I choose Lady Kethara of House Velthara, not as rebellion against Thessari social expectations, not as deliberate selection of unexpected option to make political statement about challenging their hierarchy, simply because she was his choice. The noble whose background and expertise made her the obvious selection for partnership that would be meaningful to him personally and valuable for genuine cultural exchange rather than just political positioning. The room reacts before Kethara can process what just happened. Murmurs ripple through the assembled Thessari. Surprise, confusion, rapid recalculation as nobles try to understand what they're witnessing. What strategic advantage does this human see that they've been missing? Why would he choose the consistently overlooked Lady Kethara when more obviously advantageous options remain available? The human diplomatic personnel show similar surprise. David's choice wasn't among the strategically optimal selections their pre-ceremony briefings recommended. Several human diplomats exchange glances that communicate confusion about whether David misunderstood the selection parameters or whether he's making some calculated move they don't recognize. Lord Vethros, Thessari chief counselor observing the ceremony, shows visible surprise mixed with professional reassessment. He's reviewing what he knows about Lady Kethara, trying to identify what value this human cultural advisor recognized that Thessari's social consensus overlooked. But what reshapes Kethara's world is smaller than the public spectacle of unexpected selection. David crosses the ceremonial space to where she stands. Standard protocol would be for the selected Thessari noble to approach the human who chose them, acknowledging the honor of being selected. But David moves toward her instead, closing the distance without waiting for her to perform the expected deference. He meets her eyes directly and does not look away. Doesn't show the subtle withdrawal she's learned to expect from every social interaction. Doesn't display the careful measured distance that accompanies any acknowledgement of her presence. Doesn't perform the polite but brief engagement that fulfills protocol while minimizing actual contact. He looks at her with direct, genuine attention, seeing her rather than seeing past her toward more desirable options. Maintaining eye contact that communicates she's worth his focus rather than being obstacle to be navigated towards someone more important. He speaks quietly, meant just for her rather than for the assembled audience witnessing the selection. Lady Kethara, I've read your published work on pre-alliance Thessari diplomatic frameworks. Your analysis of how historical cultural exchange models might inform current alliance relationship building was particularly insightful. I've studied your linguistic research comparing Thessari and human communication structures. When I considered which partnership would be most meaningful to me personally and most valuable for genuine cultural exchange rather than just strategic positioning, you were the only choice I seriously considered. I hope this alliance will be acceptable to you, he adds. I know the selection was my choice rather than mutual negotiation, but I'm hoping we can build partnership based on genuine intellectual respect and shared interests rather than just fulfilling diplomatic obligations. Kethara stares at him, unable to formulate immediate response. Years of defensive emotional distance have left her unprepared for genuine selection, for being chosen deliberately and sincerely rather than being overlooked or accepted with reluctance. She spent so long expecting rejection that acceptance, real acceptance, based on recognition of her actual worth rather than on protocol obligations, fit into the emotional frameworks she's developed for protecting herself. You read my work, she manages to say, her voice showing the shock she can't entirely control. You actually read my published analyses rather than just reviewing the diplomatic summary. Of course, David responds, as though this is obvious rather than extraordinary. How else would I make informed decision about partnership? The diplomatic briefings provide useful background, but they don't tell me whether someone's thinking aligns with my interests or whether we'd have foundation for genuine intellectual exchange. Your actual work does. I found your framework for analyzing cultural exchange through historical diplomatic precedents particularly sophisticated, he continues. The way you integrated Thessari philosophical concepts about relationship building with practical analysis of what actually worked in historical negotiations. That's exactly the kind of thinking I value in cultural studies. He's speaking to her as intellectual equal, as colleague whose work he respects. as person whose expertise matters to him professionally and whose partnership he sought deliberately rather than accepting reluctantly. Kethara feels something breaking inside her, not breaking badly, but breaking open, like defensive walls crumbling because they're no longer needed to protect against expected rejection. "This is acceptable to me," she says quietly, traditional formal response to alliance selection. But her voice carries more than formal acceptance. It carries years of resigned isolation beginning to crack under weight of genuine recognition she'd stopped believing she would ever receive. The matching ceremony continues, but Kethara barely registers the remaining selections. She's standing beside David now. Protocol requires the selected pairs to stand together once matches are made, trying to process what just happened. She was chosen, deliberately, by someone who actually read her work and who selected her because he valued what she'd accomplished rather than despite it. After the ceremony concludes, during the formal reception where the newly matched pairs are expected to socialize with assembled diplomats and nobles, Kethara observes reactions to David's selection. Some Thessari nobles approach David with barely concealed confusion, trying to understand his choice through careful diplomatic inquiries about his strategic thinking. David responds with honest directness that seems to confuse them further. He chose Lady Kethara because her expertise aligned with his interests and because her work impressed him. No hidden political calculation. No strategy they're missing. Other nobles approach Kethara with reassessment visible in their bearing. If this distinguished human cultural advisor saw value in her worth selecting, perhaps they've been missing something. Perhaps Lady Kethara is more strategically important than social consensus suggested. Kethara recognizes the pattern. She's being reevaluated not because anyone suddenly sees her actual worth, but because David's selection signals she might have value they overlooked. They're responding to his validation rather than recognizing her independent merit. It's deeply ironic. Years of accomplishment and expertise didn't earn their respect, but one human's sincere choice makes them reconsider their dismissal. Lord Vethro's approaches the newly matched pair during the reception. "Dr. Chen, I must admit your selection surprised many of us. Lady Kethara is certainly of distinguished lineage, but we had anticipated you might select partnership offering more immediate political advantages. May I ask what factors influenced your decision?" "I selected partnership offering genuine intellectual compatibility and mutual respect," David responds simply. Lady Kethara's expertise in cultural exchange frameworks and her linguistic research align directly with my professional interests. Her work demonstrates sophisticated thinking that I find more valuable than whatever immediate political advantages might come from other selections. Also, David adds with slight smile, "I've learned that people who are consistently undervalued by social consensus often possess qualities that those who are constantly sought after lack. Depth, resilience, absence of entitlement, genuine rather than performed expertise. Lady Kethara's social position suggested to me that Thessari aristocratic hierarchy might be overlooking someone worth knowing." Vethros processes this perspective, human outsider identifying value that Thessari social structure missed, selecting based on actual assessment rather than on inherited biases. "That's remarkably perceptive analysis, Dr. Chen," Vethros observes, "and somewhat indicting of our social dynamics." "Not indicting," David corrects gently. "Just recognizing that every culture has biases that cause them to undervalue certain people. Sometimes it takes outsider, free from those inherited biases, to see worth that others stopped looking for." After Vethros moves away, Kethara speaks quietly to David. "You've made me subject of intense speculation. Everyone is trying to understand what strategic advantage you saw that they missed. They're recalculating my value based on your selection rather than based on any recognition of my actual accomplishments." "Does that bother you?" David asks. "It's complicated," Kethara admits. "Part of me resents that your validation matters more to them than years of my actual work did. But another part is just grateful to be chosen at all, regardless of their motivations for suddenly reassessing me." "You shouldn't have to be grateful for being chosen," David says firmly. "Being selected for alliance marriage partnership shouldn't be extraordinary validation. It should be recognition of your obvious worth. The fact that Thessari's social hierarchy made you feel unwanted despite your expertise and accomplishments is their failure, not yours." "But I felt unwanted for years," Kethara responds, her voice showing vulnerability she rarely allows. I stopped hoping anyone would choose me, learned to accept that I would be included for protocol but never valued for myself. And then you stepped forward and spoke my name as if it was obvious choice, as if you'd never considered selecting anyone else. That's because you were the obvious choice, David confirms. When I reviewed all available information about the Thessari nobles selected for this program, you were the only one whose expertise and interests aligned with mine strongly enough to make partnership meaningful rather than just politically convenient. I genuinely didn't seriously consider other options once I'd read your work. The room reacted with surprise when I announced my selection, he continues. But that surprise reflects their biases, not reality. They were surprised because they'd decided you weren't desirable choice. I wasn't surprised because I'd made my decision based on actual assessment rather than on social consensus. You met my eyes and didn't look away, Kethara says quietly. When you crossed the ceremonial space to stand with me after selecting me, you looked at me directly and maintained eye contact. You don't know how rare that is. How most people's eyes slide past me even when they're speaking to me. As if maintaining eye contact with someone as socially disfavored as I am is uncomfortable. Then most people are missing what's worth seeing, David responds. I looked at you and saw someone whose work I respect, whose expertise I value, whose partnership I deliberately sought. Why would I look away from that? Several weeks later, after the initial ceremonial formalities have concluded, and the matched pairs are beginning to actually build their alliance partnerships, Kethara and David have private conversation in David's diplomatic quarters. I need to know, Kethara says carefully. Was choosing me actually based on genuine assessment of my work and expertise, or was it political calculation about selecting unexpected option to make statement about challenging Thessari's social hierarchy? David looks at her with the same direct attention he showed during the matching ceremony. It was genuine assessment. I read your published analyses, actually read them, not just reviewed summaries. I found work that impressed me professionally and that aligned with my research interests. When I considered which partnership would create foundation for genuine intellectual exchange rather than just political positioning, you were obvious choice. I didn't choose you to make political statement, he continues. I chose you because partnership with you offers what I actually value, mutual respect, shared intellectual interests, collaboration with someone whose expertise I genuinely admire. That you happen to have been undervalued by Thessari's social consensus made the choice easier rather than harder. Because I prefer working with people who have substance over people who have social validation. Why, Kethara asks, why does being socially undervalued make someone preferable to you? Because being consistently chosen creates entitlement, David explains. People who are always sought after, who always receive validation, often stop developing depth. They don't need to. Their social position provides everything they need regardless of their actual substance. But people who are overlooked despite genuine worth develop different qualities. They build actual expertise because they can't rely on social validation. They maintain humility because they've experienced being dismissed. They value genuine recognition when it comes because they know what absence of recognition feels like. You were unwanted for years by people whose judgment was based on biases rather than on assessment, David continues. That's their loss and it's unjust. But it also means that when I chose you, my choice was based entirely on recognition of your actual worth, rather than on performing selection that social consensus expected. You know, my selection was genuine because I had no social pressure to choose you, quite the opposite. Which means our partnership starts from foundation of authentic mutual respect, rather than from strategic convenience. One sincere decision can dismantle years of quiet rejection, Kethara says softly. You stepped forward and spoke my name, and suddenly years of resigned acceptance that I was unwanted started breaking apart. Because someone saw worth that others stopped looking for. Because outsider free from inherited bias recognized what Thessari's social hierarchy missed. Sometimes it takes outsider to see clearly, David agrees. I wasn't bound by whatever social calculations made Thessari nobles avoid you. I just assessed your actual expertise and accomplishments without the interference of biases I don't share. And what I saw was someone obviously worth choosing. The only mystery to me is why anyone would have overlooked you in the first place. For years, she stood where others avoided standing. Conversations curved around her like water around stone. proposals discussed in theory but never directed at her. Even kindness felt measured, careful, distant, temporary. She learned to expect the pause after introductions. The subtle shift in posture that meant someone else would be preferred. She stopped hoping before anyone noticed. Then the choice was offered publicly, formally. Names spoken, futures weighed. No one looked at her when the moment came. She had already prepared herself for that. The human did not hesitate. He stepped forward without flourish, without strategy, and spoke her name as if it had always been the only one under consideration, not out of rebellion, not out of pity, simply because to him she was the obvious choice. The room reacted before she could. Murmurs, surprise, calculations undone. But what reshaped her world was smaller than the spectacle. He met her eyes and did not look away. The transformative power of being chosen intentionally. One sincere decision dismantling years of quiet rejection. Sometimes it takes an outsider, free from inherited bias, to see worth that others stopped looking for long ago. That changes everything,